Thanks, Jacob. And thanks to all three papers, all fascinating and all very different, but intersecting in suggestive ways, I'm sure, in all your minds in different ways. So I've been asked to get the conversation rolling. So get your questions ready. But I might start with, well, let's see. I might start with throwing out a question that came to me from each of the three, and rather than just address them one by one, because we want them to mesh together, you can just organically choose which one you'd like to address and ignore the other two, or it may come up as we go. Actually, Jacob, just at the end there, you made me think of, and the drone stuff as well, the Google Glass phenomenon, which seems to have disappeared for a while, but just like cell phones had several waves and attempts to come in, I'm sure we haven't seen the last of even Google Glass. And the fact that some of these so-called explorers would get beaten up in fast food venues and things, then they attests to the kind of sense that this is a type of invasion we're not ready for yet. The fully cyborg individual, but that might be incremental as well. So, for Agnes, the right to be forgotten precedent, I think of the Streisand effect. Are you familiar with the Streisand effect? Which does everybody know what that is? Apparently Barbara Streisand wanted her, am I saying it wrong? Oh, okay. Yes, she was trying to get her home expunged from, I think it was Google Earth, so that there weren't any photos of it. And when the public got wind of this, they would just post hundreds and thousands of pictures of her home from various angles. And so that's since become a kind of instance where anytime you try and bury information or try to be forgotten, it will rebound and actually get worse. And the most recent example of that was UC Davis, the pepper spray cop. It came out that the University of California system paid $100,000 to expunge pepper spray cop from the internet's memory. And in the last week, I don't know about your feeds, but I've had that officer has jumped back into my feed lately in an example of the Streisand effect. So I'd be interested for us to talk a little more, because I know Marc would like to debate the right to be forgotten mandate premise example, and how that might work in this post-Westphalian internet. So that's one of the things I think we can zoom in on. Another is, we tend to think of ideas as vaporous things that we can't quite grasp or that are invisible, a bit like germs or bacteria. But I'm wondering about the drone itself as an idea, as a materialized idea which came to pass in the form of a drone. Like, drones don't just fall out of the sky. Somebody has to have the idea of building a drone. And you sort of imply that with the notion of the technological imperative. So I'm interested in the idea of these technologies themselves as being invasive ideas, as kind of crystallized ideology. And that maybe links to the third question for Jacob, is that something like, one example is a drone, but another might be the Fitbit that measures your steps. I found out recently that a lot of corporations are using the Fitbit as part of their wellness program. And so that is an idea. So, right, saying we want to have our employees be surveilled at the level of their, heart rates and blood pressure and things like that. So we tend to think of invasive ideas as these foreign ideas of terroristic ideas or such, communism, whatever. But what about neoliberalism as a kind of idea that is an enemy within, one that we don't think of as invasive because we live it and we experience it, where we live and breathe it, and yet this idea came from somewhere. I don't think it came from precarious workers. So neoliberalism is an invasive idea, and its various technological instantiations. So maybe we should start with the discussion about the right to be forgotten. I don't know, Marc, you had thoughts.
Okay, I'll jump in, and let me just begin my remarks by saying one of the great challenges working in the privacy field as a civil liberties advocate and a human rights advocate is always to find solutions that protect freedom of speech and government transparency. There's a common sense intuition, which I think is not correct, that whenever we're talking about privacy, we're balancing privacy against freedom of speech, or we're balancing privacy against government transparency. I think this fundamentally misunderstands the nature of the right. Oftentimes, when people say privacy, what they're really talking about is government secrecy or corporate secrecy. And the claim there is not one of personal privacy as a fundamental right, and clearly a freedom of expression claim or a government transparency claim should prevail. I give this background because the topic which Agnes raised has been particularly difficult in this space about right to be forgotten. I've given talks on this around the world. I feel quite strongly, and I'm going to say something truly radical. I don't know if that's possible here, but I'm just going to put it out there and see what happens. The right to be forgotten decision is so profoundly misunderstood in the United States. Not only is it good for freedom of expression, it's good for the future architecture of the internet and the hope for the widespread dissemination of information from multiple providers. I believe both of these statements deeply. I believe it is not against freedom of expression, and I believe it is a good thing to hold a search engine like Google accountable, liable for the consequences of privacy invading acts, precisely so that those providers of information on the internet, the actual news organizations, are protected. Now, let me just say a few words about the case. I don't want this to take up forever, but I would love to continue the discussion with others who are interested. This case is about a private Spanish citizen whose personal bankruptcy, which he had, by the way, satisfied, and which had occurred in the 1990s, had been suddenly made available 10 years later through the emergence of internet search, and most specifically through Google. People came to him and they said, whenever I type your name in, I see this news article from 10 years ago about how you lost your home or whatever happened. He said, well, that's really unfair to me. I mean, it's not who I am, right? And by the way, I satisfied the debt. He goes to the newspaper and he goes to Google and he says, please take this article down, please take the links down. It's unfair to me, right? The Spanish Data Protection Agency says the news organization is a news organization and we're not going to tell them what they should publish. But Google, which is a commercial search provider, which obtains commercial value from the publication of others' information, can, in some circumstances, be held to account. And we think this is one of those circumstances. Not all circumstances, but this is private information about a private individual. Google gets very upset about this decision. The case, by the way, is not called the right to be forgotten case. It's called Google versus Spain. Google sues the Spanish government for trying to enforce its privacy law. And the decision goes to the Court of Justice of the European Union, the High Court of Europe, which looks very closely at this and in a very reasoned decision reaches the same conclusion. And by the way, this is very important to know about the decision. It says on the one hand, we have the privacy interest of the individual, and on the other hand, we have the right of the public to access information about individual. Not a freedom of expression issue, not a censorship issue. This is not China shutting down speech on the internet. This is about whether or not you get access to information about individuals. And so the High Court says, in this instance, it may be appropriate for Google to remove the link. The story doesn't go away. There's no Orwellian memory hole here. In fact, if you want to get the story, think about this. If you're a publisher, where do you get it? you don't go to the company that dominates 90% of search in Europe, you go to the actual publisher that's online providing news to the public, which is my second point. So how we understand that case turns out to be enormously important. Now I'm going to get really, I had two radical points. I'm going to make my last radical point. And I made this argument, by the way, I've written about this in a lot of places. But I did this in USA Today. I said, I read that opinion, and what struck me was not that the origins were from Spain or from Luxembourg. The origin to me was the Brandeis article on the right to privacy. Because when the American people's lawyer, future Supreme Court Justice, argued for the right to privacy in 1890, the very first exception he said was, in some circumstances, the public will have the right to know about true private facts of individuals. And in those cases, that privacy right will have to give way to the public's right. And I agree with that, by the way. If this Spanish citizen was being considered to be Minister of Justice in Spain, and he had a bankruptcy 10 years ago, it's relevant, and we should know it. But he wasn't, and it isn't. And the decision there was correct. It is pro-First Amendment. It is pro a robust internet architecture, and it's very much a part of the American legal tradition.
Do you want to respond to that, Agnes?
No.
No?
I
Or
don't,
do you want to
no,
bring
no,
it somewhere else?
I don't disagree. I don't disagree with it. The decision, I mean, I don't know how much you know about it, but both Marc and I probably have I've had similar experiences. This is the most heated, painful, conflict-ridden issue at the moment within our community. I organized a discussion about it 2 weeks ago, and I thought we were all going to kill each other. So,
I'm glad I brought it up to begin the question and answer.
It's a source of intense debate. What is misunderstood around the decisions is from the way it's being framed in the United States. It's being framed basically as European disliking Google and trying to attack and undermine a US corporation. And they've tried to do that using many tools, antitrust being one of them. But the right to be forgotten is one of the tool that is being used right now to try to go after a very effective US corporations. What is not very well understood in the current framing of the right to be forgotten is that it has very ancient roots by the context of the digital world. The right to be forgotten is not a creation of the last 2 years. It has been around for decades. It is present in political theory. It is also a movement, a civil society-driven movement at grassroots level, in Europe in particular, from mothers and fathers of kids. It's very based around the child and the fact that children now, as we have been hearing, are putting things out in the public world that they may regret very deeply when they enter the workforce. So there are many sources to the demand for the right to be forgotten, including at grassroots level, and these are not understood. Second, it is not a European issue, as my slide was demonstrating. It's remarkable that a decision such as that one, within 2 years, got quoted in almost 20, 30 different decisions around the world. I don't think there is any other cases. And what it shows is how much that decision is reflecting people's anguish over internet. And the court is reflecting that anguish to me. So it's not just going after Google and after a corporation, it's also reflecting something very deep within people that they actually would like eventually to be forgotten, provided it, Thirdly, what I find interesting, if we go back to the topic. And I think there are sufficient garde-fous to protect freedom of expression, but it's, of course, there are some tension there. What is interesting with the case is right now is what I was pointing out, is the fact that it is, Google is in many ways an idea, a US idea. This you can hear around the world. We love it, speaking as a non-American, but we also recognize that through Google, it's US culture that comes to us. So it is, it's an idea. The terms of services reflect US culture, US norms. They do not reflect global norms or European norms. So what you add through Google is an invasion of some kind, but benevolent to a large extent, although after everything I've heard, I'm starting to wonder, but never mind. It is still overall a fantastic, incredible tools, which I love myself. But it is an invasion of some kind. It is, it's a US business model, and it's US norms that are being driven into the world through the terms and services. What's happening right now is very much a very Westphalian kind of conflict with a number of countries, beginning with France and the European Union, saying, well, actually, we're going to fight back. And not only are we going to try to control the way Google functions, that is the way the concept, the social norm, and the business model function, we're also going to fight back by forcing our own norms. And that's what is interesting with the current phase of the right to be forgotten. It is that the French regulator has said, we want that decision to be enforced globally. And that becomes an extraterritorial force that is being imposed on the French decision. The right to be de-indexed is not just limited to google.fr. It is to be implemented to google.com. And by so doing, France is, almost it's like a reaction in physics, is reacting back at Google and saying, now it's our own norm that we want to impose extraterritorially. And you do see a lot of it currently in the world of internet around data location, data protection. There is a lot of actually very Westphalian conflict being played out in the digital world. So while it is different, of course, the digital world is different from the material world, there are old conflicts that are being played out in that way.
So let's open this up to, unless Jacob had a postscript on this, sorry.
Oh, it's all right. We can, not on the right to be forgotten.
Yeah, I think we want to open this up a little more to see what other
Sure.
people are, where they're putting the connections. So please.
Thank you. Is this on? Yeah. My question is really simple and relatively primitive. As a social scientist, many of us know people who've gone to jail for not providing information in criminal cases in order to protect the people that they have sworn the allegiance to protect in the interest of maintaining their anonymity. So my question is really, well, there are a couple, but I'll try to wrap them into one, which is, how is it that Google can both... Oh, I'm sorry. Is that okay? How is it that Google can both withhold information, say, from government or court in the interest of protecting my privacy, and at the same time tell me that they're not going to tell me the criteria around which they decide whether or not I can or cannot be erased?
Well, that's an interesting question. I'm not quite sure. Google tells you what information about you they've just...
When Google says to the government that they're not going to hand over certain information based upon their requirement to protect the privacy of the people that they have information on the one hand, and on the other, tell the people, as it were, that they're protecting that they do not have the right to know the grounds upon which they actually will or will not erase them. That is to say, they don't have algorithmic transparency.
Yeah, I mean, it's an interesting question. I think I understand what you're asking, although oddly, I would almost flip around the premises. So in fact, Google routinely discloses information about you to the federal government, does not disclose that fact to you, which, by the way, we've made this argument with regard to all internet companies. I know we're kind of picking on Google today, though frankly, I think they've earned it. But it is a general proposition that when anyone in possession of your information turns it over to the government, we think you should have you should have that right. And that's one of the debates right now about some of the NSA post-Snowden FISA reforms. But I think so on the first point, actually I don't think you do know. Now, on the second point, which is a criticism that some journalists have raised about the right to be forgotten implementation, they said, why is it that Google gets to make this decision as opposed to a court, which I think is the point that you're making. So a couple of thoughts on this. First of all, I see this simply as compliance. Google is subject to law. There's a decision that says people have a right to go to the company and have the links removed. Google's expected to comply. If the individual's not satisfied with the outcome, they still have a legal redress. So you might go to the company and say, please remove the link, and they go into their black room and come back and say, no, we've decided not to. You still have a legal basis, as the court in Luxembourg said, to go to a data protection authority in Europe and say, I think they should, and someone will make a decision. But here's the key point on that issue, where I think there's also been quite a bit of confusion. I think if there's a private matter that you have the right to have removed, you would like to have it resolved between you and the company without opening it up, to journalists and third parties to say, well, you removed that, search record, but you didn't remove that search record, because of course now you've created an enormous disincentive for people to exercise their rights, and we're very familiar with that from other areas of social science. So I think these are actually very important questions to be asking and thinking about. I do think the discussion in the US has been skewed in many ways. I mean, I agree with a lot of what Agnes said. Certainly one of the most fascinating points, which we could come back to, is the dissemination of legal decisions because of our increasingly interconnected world. This is something that Justice Breyer has been writing about quite a bit, and it's really quite important in terms of the internet. So on that point, I agree, but I actually don't agree with the point that this has been cast as an effort to go after Google. It's been cast in the US as European data protection law colliding with US free expression law. I think that's the way it's largely been presented, and I don't think that's an accurate framing.
Miriam. Yes.
Okay. Thank you so much for a fantastic panel and great papers. I just was going to try to bring it back a little bit to the larger context of the conference about invasive others on different levels. So I'm wondering how what we consider invasive ideas or technologies help to determine what other kinds of things we consider invasive. So for instance, there are drones at the border, right? So drones then become part of us while the things at the border, crossing the border, become invasive. There are face print technology, other kinds of biometrics, as you were talking about, that are used to control and regulate migrants and refugees in ways that are, one might call it, public safety, but I mean, it constitutes them as an invasive other. And similarly, these technologies are used often to surveil pandemics or epidemics. So you think of the technologies used in Ebola and where to locate it and so on. So I just want to see how you would think about these invasives in relation to one another, how one constitutes the other, how when something becomes more part of us, then something else becomes more invasive, and so on. So to put these different things, even though they're different entities and they might be operating at different scales, but put them in dialogue to think about how they determine one another.
Do you want to jump in?
Sure. Well, it's a good question and a broad one in some ways. I mean, I think one way of looking at things is that so many of these processes we're talking about depend on a certain type of informed consent, and I think that's very lacking, whether we're talking about just people understanding the terms of service agreements that they agree to all the time, or just the various types of monitoring to which people are subjected. There's a real lack of consent and education and awareness. But I think one idea that you kind of pointed to is that certainly for some people, certain processes or ideas or ways of being tracked are not invasive, or opinions can vary among well-meaning people, and a lot of this stuff can be sort of a matter of personal preference. This is perhaps not as consequential an example, but does show, I think, how certain people think and how certain people approach these environments as more real perhaps than others. And I'll be more specific, which is that sometimes on Twitter you see people, especially people who are in some sort of intense debate or argument, then someone else chimes in and someone might say, like, get out of my mentions. That's sort of a common thing. There's this way in which people see someone kind of, even though it's a public space, ostensibly sort of a public forum, and the conversation is being had publicly, sometimes when certain people jump in who are considered unwelcome in one way or another, or just simply their attitude or the way they enter the conversation, people say, get out of my mentions, basically stop talking to me, you're blocked, whatever. Now, that may or may not be a kind of a reasonable reaction depending on the situation, but I think it also shows that even when we have certain ideas about publicness or about making ourselves available to being watched and acting out certain behaviors in public, we might not always be comfortable with having others involved, whether it's responding to our conversation or or collecting data about us. And so there's a way in which various conceptions, I think, of consent and privacy actually operate more on a spectrum or a continuum, rather than saying, a conversation on Twitter perhaps is totally public or private. We may have to think more in terms of kind of gradations of what might be allowed depending on different types of values and circumstances. I don't know if that answers it.
If I may add a few things, I think that the technologies, the information technology, is a tool to define what is the other and who is the invader, as much as it is a tool to define who is us. That's what is remarkable about that. That's the first thing. The second, as I mentioned maybe quickly earlier, is that it's a technology that allows us to redefine community beyond borders, but yet they are very strong communities with big walls, and the way we protect our community online is quite like a vigilante of some kind. We don't want these people to be following us, and we don't want to listen to them on Twitter. And so we create real virtual walls around our community. It's the echo chamber, which is one of the issue with one of the potential drawback of that fantastic technology. So that to me is what that's what is making that technology so important. And with the example that we had heard as well around biometrics or the drones, it is about identifying who is the invader. Mm-hmm. It's and ultimately and the invader from within. That's very clear, but that's not new. I think any invaders at some point becomes is defined as from without, but there are many of them that from within. Historically, when you look back at which ideas, which people have been pushed back, killed, censored, imprisoned, and they are not all coming from outside. Many of them were from within. Yesterday, in the first session, there was a very interesting one of the slide was a slide from I think it was an Italian cartoon, an awful Italian cartoon against, I don't know if it was Italian, by the way, don't quote me on that. But anyway, it was a cartoon against the migrants, and you had migrants, all the migrants coming in Europe at the moment, and there were some rats. So there were migrants and rats. And the rats were supposed to represent the terrorists and to distinguish them from the real migrants, which presumably may be the better migrants, the good other that we are ready to. It was a bit, it's not clear, but to me that cartoon, which I didn't know, was so revealing of how we represent the others. And the rat as possibly a terrorist, I don't know, reminded me then of the otherness that is very prevalent in our society as a response to terrorism, and it is the, how do you say it in English? People are being, citizens are, the citizenship of individuals that are deemed not to belong is being removed. So that France had proposed, how do you call it? Denaturalizing. So it's very prevalent right now in the Gulf countries and in the Middle East, where basically individuals that are deemed to be not from within, even though they've been there for generation and generation and generation, from one day to the next, have their citizenship removed and are physically put on a plane to go to a country where it is said that they will belong better. So, for instance, that touch, Shia minorities in Sunni-dominated countries, if they happen to be political opponents, from the day to the next, could find themselves sent back to Lebanon, for instance. In Europe, there is a possibility of people losing their citizenship if they were deemed to have committed an act which was so much outside the norms of that home that they could no longer be part of it. So the law was proposed in France. It was a constitutional reform, and that eventually it was not rejected. Eventually the government decided not to proceed after much internal complaints, and at least for once the French people reacted to it. But it is in the book of other countries. So there was a Danish man who lost his Danish citizenship early this year, I think, or late last year. And that's a very, I think it's a reflection of our time at the moment, that the use of that citizenship.
It makes me think.
Just to make two brief comments coming back to your question. When Ariane approached me about the conference and I saw the conference theme, the invasive other, I had this first thought, which is, of course, in the context of a sort of a liberal philosophy, we try to be open to the other. We try to be open to people. We try to be open to ideas. And so the phrase, the invasive other, seems almost in that setting purposely provocative, as if we would push back and say, well, people who describe the other as invasive are in a sense closed-minded and anti-immigrant. And I understood that. And I said, well, I can imagine some way we can carry that debate over to the internet and it would play out as it has elsewhere. But then I thought about it some more, and it really was interesting for me to imagine, well, what would be the invasive other that kind of falls outside of that liberal philosophical tradition? And it became, in effect, the rise of the machine, right? That we do not give that kind of regard and respect to our devices, and yet they seem to be obtaining this type of authority and autonomy. So that actually gave me the insight to give the presentation to you that I have today about drones. But let me say a few more words on the theme, because I can actually talk more about it. We've done a number of privacy cases over the years about what strikes me as the crossover moment when the internet was no longer the electronic online library that we're all so happy about and comfortable with because we get free information any moment, but the internet kind of left the wire and began to enter our homes. So, for example, there's a thermostat company called Nest which by the way was acquired by Google, that captures a great deal of information about what happens inside of your home. It's not just the heat sensor, by the way. There's also audio. There's an audio sensor inside the Nest thermostat. There are always on devices in your home, right? What's Amazon's device called?
That Echo?
Echo,
Yeah.
right? Samsung TV, Apple Siri. We did a complaint to the US Federal Trade Commission in which we said, in effect, these physical devices in the home connected to the internet are engaging in a form of surveillance of private spaces. And, you know, I appreciated your remarks. I would still consider my living room a private space, and if I'm talking with my family or, you know, watching TV, I don't think that needs to be broadcast out online and stored on a remote server operated by some large internet firm. But that's actually what's happening. So I think there's an enormous area of space to explore about how the internet, which we have almost, I would say, romanticized in terms of its presence in our this moment in time, is increasingly reaching into our physical world. And it is not just the drones, it is in many other places. In fact, it's most likely in your pocket.
The border example made me think of that we might replace Althusser's policeman with a drone, and who interpolating and hailing who the other is. And that's where the machines, your remarks about the identity of these drones, they seem to be Agamben's perfect kind of whatever creature, because they have the right to not be forgotten, but the right to be identityless. And ironically, in the biopolitical age, having a non-fixed identity means greater agency.
Greater freedom.
Yes, in certain contexts. So I think that's relevant too. So, Gina, please.
Thank you so much for your talk, and I'm so glad. Thank you so much for your talk, and I'm so glad you just. That was kind of a great segue into what I wanted to offer here. I just want to infuse this conversation a little bit with some thought from critical disability studies, because I think there's a bit that it can offer to the kind of non-identity conversation here. Earlier, Jacob, you mentioned that you're not going to go into the history a little bit of the differences between public and private, but many feminist disability theorists bring forth the idea that privacy is a kind of socially constructed class idea that is really at the heart of the kind of production of the Enlightenment individual, right? And the kind of individualizing nature of neoliberalist capitalism. So what I want to offer is to challenge this notion of privacy in the first place, because I think perhaps, and I could be wrong, but I don't think it's necessary for, well, it might not be necessary at all. That's another question, but I don't think it's necessary for invasion. Sorry, give me a second here. So we talked about Fitbit, for example. It is my understanding that a lot of companies have encouraged their workers to use these technologies to monitor behavioral modes of navigating space, and you know, how much do you sleep and how much do you eat, how many calories, things like this, in order to, it's not just to keep their workers healthy, but it's to cut down on costs for health insurance, for long-term insurance, things like this. And a lot of the times, health insurance companies are encouraging this by employers and CEOs. Just like right now with a lot of Medicaid changes that happened in the United States with the ACA, a lot of states are adopting a payment model where companies are getting paid bonuses to keep their Medicaid costs down by encouraging people to responsibly monitor themselves and kind of manage disability. So what I want to offer here is that privacy put back into context, in that historical context, because we did exist before the Enlightenment, before this kind of self-contained individual notion kind of came about, and ask, what is it about privacy that that we need? What is it? Is it the right to be? Is it dignity? Is it the right to association? Is it social value? I want to just suggest that neoliberalist thought is the invasive other, and how can we fight that? Because I think to unsecuritize the self, I don't think it's to give up agency.
Mm-hmm.
So I just play with that if you can.
I'll just say a couple of words. I really appreciated your comments. I had the honor with the most recent case book on privacy law to work with Anita Allen. And Anita is a very distinguished scholar of feminist legal theory. And we would read the same cases and the same materials and come to almost the opposite conclusions. I mean, Brandeis was my big hero and articulated the right to privacy. And her article was about, Brandeis as the Boston patrician propagating, male hierarchy, yes? So I'm very much aware, or at least I try to be aware of the perspective, and in working on this most recent project really tried to take this into account. But I still think the argument that I've made today works in a way, because what I'm trying to say is, however we draw a distinction among people and our ability to incorporate difference and who we are or who we seek to be, this entire realm needs to be understood as operating apart from the devices and machines that we're creating. And I have a genuine concern that we are failing in that mission at the moment in which a rapid change is taking place. So I don't have a great insight into the answer here, but I feel, whether it's post-Enlightenment or pre-Enlightenment, we're still part of this group. But there's something happening at the beginning of the 21st century which is genuinely new. And I think the point that Dominic made when he talked about drones and agency, the other concept here, of course, is freedom. I mean, is the sense of being able to pursue whatever you wish to pursue. And we are giving the freedom to the machines, and they are taking it from us.
Should I go ahead?
Yeah.
Okay. Yeah, that's a great question, and you raised some very good points. One thing I would say is I agree with this notion that privacy can be looked at different ways. I mean, the Brandeis example is useful also because, as you indicated, some people perhaps even at the time or now reinterpret the original Brandeis argument as well. He was more trying to protect his people in his social milieu of high class folks from kind of gossipy reporting on their goings on. So I think it's definitely worth kind of interrogating what we really mean when we say privacy, and also realizing that it's not this monolithic thing. And so that's why I think we should put more stock in these ideas of, well, what does privacy facilitate? And to me, it's really important for things like identity formation or just having some interiority or privacy of thought, but also autonomy and control. And autonomy as a kind of freedom and control over, who you are in the world and how you conduct yourself. And the kind of privacy issues I'm concerned about, I think, are often about ways in which people have that autonomy or control taken away from them in favor of opaque, often automated systems. Also systems that often create a certain standard of privacy or of desirable behavior and then kind of make it algorithmically determined, where if you deviate from sort of the the norm or the pattern that's programmed into the system, then you're immediately deemed undesirable or perhaps an invasive other. I had one other note in my notes here, I think. And I also think increasingly we see that privacy is also kind of dependent on who's really sort of controlling this kind of data. So one reason why I talk about the home is now the home has definitely been made more transparent, but there are all kinds of varying and overlapping privacy dynamics that happen within the home and between the people who live there. And now also you increasingly see that whoever is kind of in charge of the devices in the home, whether it's the person who lives there who's the primary breadwinner and installs the Nest and the cameras and everything else, or whether it's the company to which this stuff is outsourced, actually has a lot of control over the home as this place of data production and the kind of the privacy and autonomy that's granted to the people within the home. So that's why I think that I suppose that actually maybe I should stop there, but I think this notion is that we can't just say we want to preserve privacy just because we want people to be able to have total control of themselves, and because then you risk kind of giving over too much power to the existing authority figures that we have, whether it's corporate or governmental or simply kind of some patriarchal authority. And so that's why we definitely have to be willing to interrogate matters of difference and also say that there is no monolithic definition of privacy, and also why I think context collapse is useful, because we see that privacy is so contextually dependent, and it doesn't while it has to be historically informed, it doesn't necessarily need to be. We can say that 21st century privacy is going to be something a lot different. It doesn't have to abide by certain Enlightenment norms or that history, but we do need to ask those questions, I think, about do we need to just totally reinvent it for current standards and values today.
Just maybe somebody that you could consider. I don't know how gender sensitive he is in his thinking. I just came across an article he wrote very recently, Joe Kanatachi. He has been appointed UN Special Rapporteur on the right to privacy a couple of months ago. He's a professor in the Netherlands and in Malta, and he is trying to push for the concept of the right to personality. And that is, so I can forward you the article he has written on the concept. It's reflective of thinking in Europe in particular. So the right to personality is very central to the way European political theorists, probably not very gender sensitive or disability sensitive, that I can't say I've thought about, but that could be a way of responding to your question, which is what is it about privacy that we need to keep and that we need to fight for, which is basically the question he's asking. And that's why he ended up with this focus on personality so that's the first thing. And the second thing, because I think gender has been very absent from our discussion, technology has not been very sensitive to the specificities of women in the public space, in the digital public space. So there has been a number of ongoing discussion right now around, for instance, the porn revenge website. That's one example of how technology has turned against women, not just women, but in particular. I mean, 98% of the victims are women. Online harassment, against it, again, it is not gender specific in its form, but it is gender specific in the enormous amount of victims that are women. So women who are being targeted online because they are women and because often they are feminist, or they have made some statements in the public space which have resulted in a number of trolls attacking them. So the technology and the digital space. Sometimes when I am in my most negative thinking, I feel, we all fought patriarchy for centuries, and then suddenly it's getting reborn in the freaking digital space, and we have to fight again. It's very interesting that a lot of technology-driven companies are not very gender sensitive at all, and there have been too many instances of the hacker world, the programmers world, being the primary driver of online harassment against women from within their own community, as a matter of fact, who were calling for some kind of gender-sensitive guidelines. So we haven't talked about how, the invasive technology is actually forcing or has forced their responses very old form of social organization, i.e. patriarchy.
Well, Gamergate, a classic example of women being the considered the invasive other.
Absolutely.
Right? Yeah.
Absolutely.
And
Can I
Jacob
respond
mentioned
to that
about the
real quick?
machismo, right? Yeah.
Yeah, I think that these points about gender are very good because we see this also, and this relates a little bit to what I said earlier about certain behaviors or even identity types becoming kind of algorithmically standardized. I mean, you see it in facial recognition technologies that can't identify people of certain races, or I think Asian women have a hard time with some facial recognition systems, or you see similar, and this happens throughout wherever there's kind of biometric monitoring, and one reason is because the people who create these systems are mostly white men, and the data sets that inform them are often similarly kind of monochromatic. So what happens when someone who is trans, for example, goes through one of the backscatter X-ray machines at the airport, suddenly they're kind of otherized and set aside as other because the system isn't programmed to really understand them or read them or tolerate them, which is really, I think, also like two different problems. I mean, because the system itself is kind of problematic because it's airport security run amok, but then you also want these systems to not, to not be able to kind of parse or accept people as they are. So there are almost two different problems there, whether we want our systems to be kind of all-inclusive and able to recognize people and let them have the freedom to be who they are, but we also don't want them kind of serving...
All captured.
Yeah, we don't want it for this. We don't want some surveillance system to be able to capture say a trans person or a person of color just for the sake of feeding into this other illiberal process or kind of bad policy.
Exactly. So.
Hi. Yeah. So, I guess the aim of my question is, I'm a student and I'm really interested in the user. I think that this forum in particular is kind of like us preaching to the choir, and I'm really interested in the idea of like the accessibility of privacy, and potentially the boundaries that word even has for education and like knowledge of what that means as applied to everyone. So my question is two parts. The first, perhaps a little bit abstract, but I'm really interested in your answers. And so I'm really interested in the definition of personal. So what does personal, I guess, protection of privacy, and that's our personal, and what is personal, especially in the virtual world? And second part of that is how the education of personal can manifest and the potential dangers of making users vulnerable with the knowledge of that education. So if we start making this accessible and telling people this is how you understand yourself personally on the virtual world and this is how you protect yourself, once you start telling people how to do that, that becomes an algorithm that can then be penetrated and used in negative ways. So, yeah.
Yeah, that's a good. We have 4 or 5 minutes left, so maybe we should get all the questions. Yeah.
I'll keep it really brief and quick. It's a fairly simple-minded and simple question. One of the ways in which I understand invasive is something that transfers across a boundary. You either see it coming from in or you see it coming from out. And one of the wonderful things your panel has done is sort of give us a sense of a pervasive other, right? Something that is everywhere and all over the place. So I guess I'm trying to understand, linking it to the sense of ideas that migrate and the sense of a pervasive kind of machine landscape, how you understand distance, and do you see, or can we see, or how do you understand a glitch in that system that allows us to be aware that something is coming across distance?
Good question. So maybe two more questions, and then we'll.
Thank you. I have just two observations. The invasive need not be from the outside. From my own perspective, like in my country, Uganda, the citizens became the other when they were opposed to the state. And then the internet was controlled in such a way that you could not access the internet from within. And instead, people went around all the government blockage and then were using Twitter while in Canada and voting in Uganda. So it was a way that they asserted their agency, and then they were able to overcome the imposed restrictions by the state, which was acting arbitrarily by introducing new laws just to prevent people from voting. And then my other observation is, I was an invasive other when I was coming to the US just recently. I was subjected to 3 times I was controlled in Germany, and then I was again controlled by the airlines, which requests for extra information in spite of the biometric information I had already given with my passport, and also with the information that you already have in the system, because they're always collecting information. And then the comment on Google is that the right to be forgotten applies strictly, from my experience, to Europeans. You have to be connected in a way to Europe before you can put across your case and request Google to remove your information. So maybe you can comment on that. Thank you.
And last.
Whoa, that's a big one. Maybe the panel should. I just will do a little note here. At first, I thought, when I raised my hand first, I thought that it was no discussion of gender, and I wanted to introduce it. But now that you've said the system, suddenly patriarchy all just reproduces itself. Just the shock. When we said the personal is political, and the early days of feeling that we must invade the private because that's where the domestic violence was happening, et cetera. That seemed so progressive, the breaking apart, and this is your talk altogether, and the different meanings of privacy, how we're right, because we wanted to break it open, and the idea of privacy. So I think, and your wonderful question. So most of the things I wanted to say have been said, but I just thought I'd give you a note, which is in the big right, turn to the right in Europe now, one of the big themes is the domus. The right wing is requesting that the home be revalued. Of course, the woman goes back into it, but also that the new idea, which fits so perfectly with neoliberalism, is that the home is sacred. Women will be inside it. The public sphere is being drained, and there's less and less of a sense of a civil society. It's really, the state and then the domus. And that happened very fast. And I guess part of what we're hearing today is how fast context collapse is happening, and how we're living at a pace. I mean, I wouldn't have expected that, but the right wing is using the idea of privacy as a very restrictive, regressive idea.
That's a lot to synthesize. We're technically out of time, so I wonder if anyone has some kind of closing thoughts, you're welcome to. Otherwise, we can, I think they were very good. Those questions function as good commentaries and observations as well, so we can continue the conversation over coffee and things. So if you do have a punctuation.
Okay, well, if you don't mind, I'll answer the first question in the back real quick, which is just that, certainly when I talk to people, I encourage people to do their research and kind of take these measures into their own hands. And if they want to use various privacy enhancing tools, I think there's nothing wrong with that. To me, it's definitely the political education that can attend that process that is most important. And I think you mentioned also something about, well, what if kind of everyone starts cracking down on their own or securing their own personal privacy? Or one example might be what might happen then. One example might be the use of ad blockers which has really improved some people's browsing experiences and makes you harder to track depending on what you're using, but also impacts some very good publishers who need that kind of ad revenue. I think the larger point is that individuals can certainly do a lot, and enough individuals working together, that becomes a movement. But the companies and governments who are controlling these technologies are definitely in the position of power and advantage, and I just don't really see that changing as long as we're kind of operating on their terms. It sort of becomes this arms race of how can you be a more responsible consumer or citizen, and how can you support the right policies and use these tools. But then you're always, these companies are always looking to supervise you more, to make the surveillance more granular and more specific. So it does seem to me like kind of a battle that can't fully be won. It doesn't mean it's not worth fighting, and perhaps worth fighting in other fields like the courts and the law. And one other question, the question about privacy kind of being used to protect the powerful, I think is interesting also. Just for example, the other day, and this will be my last comment, but there was yet another incident of a young man being thrown off a plane for speaking Arabic. And one of the interesting things that I saw was Southwest didn't really comment. That was the airline. They gave a boilerplate answer about how they're following the proper procedures and they were working with government, which essentially says we're following the algorithm we have in this situation. It's the same way that automated systems displace responsibility onto the algorithm. They said, we follow procedures. But then the other thing that they said was, to preserve his privacy, we're not going to comment further on the case or on the incident, to preserve the privacy of the man who's thrown off the plane. So this is the kind of thing we see now a lot, where you kind of have almost like a HIPAA medical attitude about privacy being applied to these other situations where we're told it's in our best interests or in the best interests of the person who's actually the victim to keep certain information private. And so I think that's something we really need to be on guard for, this way in which, the meaning of privacy kind of gets repurposed or gets recast through this business, corporate speak in order to protect powerful people.
And you, very, very quickly, I think.
I'll be quick. It's one of the other cases we worked on that pulls together several of the themes. We were involved in the litigation to remove the backscatter X-ray devices from U.S. airports. These were the devices that allowed the transportation security officials to see airline passengers basically stripped naked. Now, point one, the U.S. airports have become the front line in trying to defend the country against the invasive other. And to your point, if you want to see where the greatest inroads have been made into classifying, identifying, profiling, probing, it is in the U.S. airport. That's where that occurs. To your question, what is personal? It's being tested, you see. Because when you seek physical entry into the United States, a great part of what's happening is the government's demand for you to give up what you would have considered to be personal. Not only the shape of your body, but also who you're traveling with, what your religion is, which countries you visited to. All of this becomes a key point. And I think to your point on distance, this at least gives us the moment, the space, the snapshot to understand what that type of intrusion looks like. And then the question we ask, of course, how much of the rest of the country begins to resemble those kinds of screening techniques that we've accepted on a daily basis.
Yeah. We haven't mentioned cybernetics, and I think that is behind all of this. There's a sort of science of control communication. I think that's part of it too. So, Agnes.
And just a quick word. How do we understand distance? It's definitely not physical. And to me, the question is not so much how far as ideas traveled, but what kind of walls we're putting them, we're establishing to push them back. And what historically I think the study of freedom of expression and freedom of conscience demonstrated that actually they never traveled that much. You know, they are often from within, the ideas that are being pushed or fenced against, as the Uganda example was highlighting. The walls are created from within. I just wanted to finish on a more positive note. Yes, there is a crisis in Europe around the state and the right wing, but I do not believe that civil society has disappeared. I mean, it's everywhere. There are protests every day. In France, there were a huge protest in London. There are protests in Macedonia. Everybody's on the street, maybe not always for the right reason or with a big vision of where they want to go with their protest. Look at Brazil. I mean, people I think there is a crisis of electoral democracy, that for sure. And people in Europe and elsewhere. I mean, Brazil is an example. It's, you do have a lot of people taking to the street to express their voice, to communicate their ideas, because they feel that electoral democracy is not working at the moment.
Do demonstrations now work as they sometimes did in the past?
We don't know that, but we can. It's an open question, and we can leave it open. And just to say that you can demonstrate online, that there is a concept of online protest, that there is digital protest. So I just say, let's be a bit more positive for positive changes. It may not happen overnight with all those right-wing people on the move as well, getting power. But I'm personally always very grateful for civil society and for the power of the idea, the progressive one.
Wonderful. And so I think next year we should have the invasive self, just to balance the other. But for now, please thank the panel who did a wonderful job, I think. And thanks for your great questions.